The greatest triumphs of propaganda have been accomplished not by doing something, but by refraining from doing. Great is truth, but still greater, from a practical point of view, is silence about truth. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. Today, we are starting a new series on dystopian horrors because the world apparently isn't dystopian enough.
Well, I will get us started. As Lisa just said in our introduction, we are beginning a new multi-episode series on dystopia or dystopian horrors. Um, I guess the first thing to mention is that we did do a series several years ago on apocalyptic horror, but we never actually really looked at just dystopia, which the two often kind of go hand in hand. They often run very similar to each other, but I think there is a big difference because dystopian fiction, or especially dystopian science fiction, where it's set in the future, a lot of times it's not set in the end of the world. There hasn't always been some great global calamity that has led to dystopia. Sometimes it happens slowly over time. So, I thought this would be an interesting topic for us to discuss. And so, I guess the first thing to really kind of do before we dive into our discussion on it is maybe just kind of give a brief overview slash history of the genre for those of you that are like not familiar with it at all. If you've never run into dystopian horror or dystopian fiction of any kind, it's really goes back to the twin, the flip side of the coin of utopia, which is a perfect society. I think it was Thomas More who coined the term in his philosophical work, where he outlines the idea of this non-existent but perfect society that we could all aspire towards. Well, dystopia is the other side of that coin. It is the imperfect society. It is the horror society, the one that people don't necessarily want to be living in, or at least most people don't. And as far as like doing some research on the history of it, there it's not something that you can just point to and say, oh, here's the very first dystopian work and here's the second, and so on and so forth. It obviously evolved over time. There are some definite precursors to it. One of the first ones that I saw that was pointed to as kind of a precursor to dystopian literature was H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Because the further and further the main character goes into the future, the worse things become until he eventually gets to this society that's completely devolved. But really, I think if hard pressed, if to put a pin on like the first dystopian novel, I think most people would say it's probably going to be Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in 1932. I've seen some others that have suggested that Yevgeny Zamyatin, his book We from 1924, is often considered the first true dystopian novel. I'm not familiar enough with him or that novel to make an educated opinion on that, but I will say that as far as an American audience, most people tend to be pretty familiar with Brave New World. If they haven't read it, they've at least heard of the novel and have a general idea. It's a future genetically engineered society that uh, Huxley really uses to kind of critique the loss of individuality, and that seems to be a common thread in a lot of 20th and 21st century dystopia is the loss of individuality. of course, another great touchstone in the history of it would be George Orwell's 1984, something that is frequently referenced. I think where even people who have not read the book are pretty familiar with the idea of the totalitarian regime that exists in 1984, and especially the way they use and manipulate language and history to control people. We have always been at war with Eurasia. We have never been at war with Eurasia. These changing stances that the public just is kind of forced to accept is another facet of 1984 that's really made it into just the common zeitgeist. I think other fairly well-known examples, just kind of moving on chronologically, would be Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which, I mean, that one is very much a response to censorship in the Joe McCarthy era of the 1950s. He depicts a world where books are banned and burned, and basically being an intellectual is pretty much outlawed. Um, not as many people have read this book, but I think more people have seen the Kubrick adaptation of it. But A Clockwork Orange, I've read the Anthony Burgess novel as well as seen the film, but they both really explore this idea of free will versus some sort of control from the government, in this case controlling the Alex character, trying to turn him into a model citizen. And then, kind of rounding that out, 1985, Margaret Atwood published her very famous novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which is actually a TV show that is airing its final season, I think, as we speak. I have not been watching it, but I believe it is currently or set to start airing. And then, of course, I mean, it's a trend. These are just sort of the high points that lots of people know, but this is definitely a subject that's been tackled both in film and in literature. I think we've seen a really big rise of it since the turn of the century, especially after 9/11. I think we've seen a lot of dystopian stories, especially a lot of YA novels um, in the last 10-15 years have had dystopian elements. The Hunger Games, the Maze Runner. I could probably ask my daughter to give me like 12 more that she knows that I've not heard of myself. But all of those all kind of come from the same well of this idea of dystopia. So I guess one thing that we might need to do during this episode is to kind of maybe try to define it a little bit better than I just did, because this is just kind of a thumbnail sketch. But also, like we do in a lot of our first episodes in a series, I think we should probably discuss, like, what is it that's so scary about this? Because we're really going to be looking at this from a horror perspective, and a lot of dystopian fiction doesn't go into the traditional horror topics or tropes the way other films may, but I think there's a lot of horrific things that happen in these dystopian stories. So I'm going to kind of open it up to Mel and Lisa to kind of jump in here now. And like, what are your thoughts? Like, what makes a dystopian story, and what makes it so scary?
That's a really good question because even as we were doing the prep work for this episode, and coming up with like, okay, what is the history that we can dig into of dystopian literature or dystopian films? And you brought up the fact, Matt, which first of all, you gave a really great overview of the history of it, and at least like hitting the high points. So I really appreciate that. But first of all, we're not always talking about something like apocalyptic or post apocalyptic, although those two do cross, as you pointed out. You brought up very briefly the idea of a utopia, this kind of like perfect place. And for a while, utopian literature was the the fashion. I mean, really before dystopian lit hit, people were writing utopias, some in earnest, but also some in satire. Um, but I think it's important to bring up that because in order to have a dystopia, you do have to have that utopia. And so in a lot of these, and I can use like The Handmaid's Tale as an example, since probably our listeners are familiar with that, either through the TV show, the movie that came out a few decades ago, or the book itself. That does present a utopia for some people. The world that is presented in The Handmaid's Tale is, I mean, if you are an extremely religious person, first of all, in that world, that is a utopia. That is a version of utopia. But also, that world was created in order to solve a problem, because one of the big problems, and it's explored in the TV show more. I mean, obviously, it's that's spread out over several seasons and not, in a novel, which makes it more difficult to explore the whole kind of world that's going on there. But the problem was that babies were not being born, was that um, women were not getting pregnant, women were unable to have babies. So there was this big drop. And that's also explored some, this idea in other things like Children of Men, the PD James novel that was turned into the movie a few years ago. I say a few years ago, decades ago, I think at this point. But um, so you do have this world that is being constructed in these stories as a way to usually to solve society's problems. And by solving society's problems, it becomes, or it's supposed to be, a utopia. The problem is, as we pointed out, dystopian literature, or a dystopian world, is where that we start to see the cracks and that starts to fall apart. So I think first you have to have, I'm going to do a little bit of my rules because I feel like I've done that in the past. Like, what are the rules of what we're playing with here? Um, but one of the rules is that it has to be somebody's version of utopia, that this was constructed in order to solve some problems. Or it's somebody's version of the perfect world, even if it's not everybody's version of the perfect world. And I think that hints at some of the horror there. I think the second thing that you really need for dystopian literature is I think you have to have somebody or a group of people that are paying the price for this perfect world. So something is being repressed, someone is paying the price for this, and that's not being acknowledged. And then I think the third thing is that usually there is either some sort of governmental agency, certainly something like in 1984. I think this is really evident, Matt, as you were pointing out. Or it's going to be some sort of ideology that is grabbing on to that power and control. So dystopian literature is about presenting a perfect world like a utopia, but then it's exposing this power dynamic. And I think it's usually shown through the ones who are experiencing the most amount of control exerted upon them, but then also who are paying the biggest price for it. So for instance, like The Powerless, The Handmaid's Tale, we're not hearing the story through the point of view of one of the men in charge. We're hearing it from a handmaid. So we're seeing her life is very much not perfect. It's the same thing with the Hunger Games. There's a reason that is from Katniss's point of view, where you have um the fact that she's from one of the poorest districts, because you're seeing this utopia that was built to stop violent uprisings, but you're seeing how it's not benefiting everybody. I'm sure Mel probably has something more to say on this. Probably she will say it better than I did because she always always is just a little bit smarter. But I don't know, Mel, how did I do with those rules of a dystopia?
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know how much I can add to that. I like your rules. I like that we have more Lisa's rules. I feel like it's been a bit. It's been a minute since we did those. It might have been disaster movies when we had those. No, I like it. So basically, I was thinking about it while you were talking. I like that you pointed out that there a lot of times people are like reacting to something or addressing something like some sort of problem, and then the idea that someone is paying a price for a perfect world, and then the idea of like something kind of controlling. I think that takes in a lot of dystopian fiction. I mean, one of the things that I've always thought about with dystopian fiction, well, there's a couple things. One is I don't think in the past, until we started thinking about it, because we had the apocalyptic series, we started thinking about this as, well, it's not apocalyptic necessarily. And I guess in the past, I'd always kind of just lumped the two together and not really thought about it. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe the horror of the dystopia is that it can keep going. Not that I want the world to end, but it's almost like an apocalyptic fiction. There's this like the world is ending and we have to figure it out somehow. Whereas dystopian fiction is like, this is just our life now. Um, and then the other thing is I've always thought about with dystopian fiction, which you mentioned, I think both of you mentioned this, uh, is the fact that one man's utopia is another person's dystopia, or like what some people or one group thinks is quote unquote perfect is not for someone else, or the fact that someone could, I guess, truly try to create a place as helpful and quote unquote good, but it kind of falls apart. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure how much more I can add to that, except that I think that's kind of where the horror comes from, is that once you're in the dystopia, it's hard, it's hard to see, like, how is this going to end, basically. And the fact that there are groups of people who can like take advantage of that. I think immediately the first things that popped into my mind when we were talking about dystopia were the books that you already talked about, like Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Again, control of people's knowledge or what they can read, what they can think. George Orwell's 1984, again, manipulation and control. Um, but I think we talked about this before we hit record. I'm kind of late to the Severance train. I just started season 2 because I watched season 1 over the course of the last couple of weeks. And we talked about how Severance has some dystopian aspects to it too, with its questions about work-life balance, but then who is kind of getting taken advantage of in order to quote unquote fix that problem. And then you also have that idea of some sort of ideology mixed with corporatization, I guess, that's in charge there, to go with your rules, Lisa. Um, it really works in various aspects of this. And I think, a couple other books that I thought of when we were first thinking about dystopia kind of fall into your problem section, I guess. I think I might have talked about this on the Monster She Wrote podcast, but the last year I read Cherie Dimeline's The Marrow Thieves, which is a book about basically global warming and climate change is happening. So things are really messed up from that. And then people lose the ability to dream. And basically there's widespread madness and all hell breaks loose. And the way that governments and corporations decide they're going to fix this problem is they have realized that in North American indigenous people can still dream. And so the larger society starts preying upon them to basically take their bone marrow to try to cure people. And so you have this basically like chasing, capturing indigenous people and putting them in places are kind of reminiscent of like the historical residential schools. And so this idea of we've messed up the planet, things are falling apart, we now have this thing that happened and we're going to fix it by basically taking advantage of this group of people. in our quest for this. And usually, again, it's like people in power who change the entire kind of governmental system to move in this direction. Um, I also thought about Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years because, well, in the last basically since right before COVID up to now, because of her uncanny ability in that book to kind of predict in 1993 what we would be facing with all the different like climate challenges and cultural challenges and pandemic, et cetera, wildfires on the West Coast, even the political situation. It can feel almost like it hits a little bit too close to home. And it's like you have to remind yourself, oh, this was written in 1993. I think it's interesting that there's something like horrifically human about dystopia, and that we kind of go through these cycles of reminding ourselves in books and movies how things can kind of go off the rails, or how things that work for some groups may really not be good for other groups, and can cause not just issues of power and control and manipulation, but you know actual like violence as well. And I guess that also is reminiscent of these young adult books like Hunger Games and Battle Royale, and these kind of interpretations of dystopian situations where literally like the zero sum game is played out through literal violence, between kind of substitute people or different groups. I mean, I guess in a weird way, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery could even be a type of dystopia where this village thinks they're doing the right thing with all their rituals, but they're actually murdering someone every year. But everybody just kind of buys into it because it's the way they've all been manipulated to think. But again, it's not apocalyptic. It's just this is how the society has kind of run its course, and now we're in it. And how do we survive it and or fight back? Because, like you said, Lisa, we usually are with the perception. We are with the people um, who are being affected by it in the most dangerous ways, trying to figure out how to survive the situation. That usually seems to be the perspective.
I wanted to jump in real quick with a phrase that you just used that I think really resonated with me, was that it's horrifically human. And I think that I cannot think of a better way to describe a dystopia, to be honest, especially if we're trying to find the points where it's different from, say, apocalyptic fiction. That is a place right there that I think makes it very distinct, is the banality of it, the mundaneness of it. Most of the people, I mean, I'm thinking of one of the things I think of first when I think of dystopia is the original Blade Runner movie. It's in this future that is, they have flying cars and synthetic humans, but everything is still gritty and dirty, and there's still poverty, and there's techno corporations that run everything, and people just kind of live their lives in quiet solitude like they do now. I mean, it doesn't seem that much different from now, except with a little bit of technological advancement. Same with something like, say, Equilibrium, which I think is a great example of dystopia. Um, but just the mundaneness of it, like I don't know if either of you have seen Blade Runner, but like Harrison Ford's character is, I mean, he just goes about, he does what he does. But I don't know, that phrase really struck a chord with me in terms of one thing that really does define utopia is just kind of the humanness of it all.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you elaborated on that, Matt. And yeah, Blade Runner is a it's a great example, I think. Um, a lot of times it is because we do sometimes see these dystopian stories being presented as some big adventure, or Mel, as you also pointed out, that we see like the zero sum game of it playing out in violence. because there is a lot of these that immediately pit person against person. Hunger Games we've mentioned a lot, battle royale, the Purge, we haven't talked about that, but I think that would definitely kind of fit because it's this, society that's almost exactly like ours, except they've decided that this is going to, by letting people have their like violent fantasies one day a year, it's going to somehow stop violence from happening the rest of the year. Which, obviously we see the problems with it, but things like the platform, that it's a foreign language horror film about a prison, but you kind of see that, or even something like Snowpiercer or Minority Report, where you really kind of see the power struggles playing out on a battleground, and that can, I don't know, that can be one type of dystopian film, but I'm like both of you in talking about like the humanity of it. I think the ones that I find most interesting and intriguing, no matter if they lean more like futuristic or sci-fi, or they don't, or there's something closer to our world, I think those are much more interesting. And here's the reason why, because I think this is really what both of you have been saying, but it helps us drill down into like why a dystopia, like why this type of horror in particular is so frightening, and what it's like hitting on us is that these kind of worlds, it's not just like The Handmaid's Tale, for instance. That novel, that TV show is not just terrifying, to experience, like, for me as a woman, because I'm like, "Oh my god, like, what would I do if I were in that situation?" And I don't even wanna, like, go down the road of being like, "Well, it could happen," you know? No need to go that dark. But one of the things that frightens me is, as we've seen in the TV show, and I haven't finished watching it because it is one of those shows that, like, really spikes my anxiety, so I've only seen, like, I think the first 2 seasons of it. Um, but where you get to see a little bit of the past of how this kind of quote unquote utopia was formed. And you see women like Serena Joy, who willingly give over their power in order to solve a problem. So she, if I remember right, was an author, like a rather successful author. I think you see her giving speeches and stuff, and she willingly kind of gives that up because she knows that, or at least she thinks she's doing it for the greater good. So it's like she willingly gives over her power to the fundamentalist Gilead. Um, and that to me is one of the scary things. And we see it too. We've mentioned Severance. And this is just, I think, to show you the um, breadth that dystopian lit can take. But I also saw the same thing there, because you see in the first episode Helly R, her entrance into the severed floor. And so you see somebody who is like willingly undergone the procedure to be severed and to not remember work when they're at home and not remember home when they're at work. And so to have that ultimate kind of work-life balance that these other people in the office have already gone through. But it's something that is presented as, and I mean, I know as you watch further episodes and further seasons, this idea is complicated, but um, you see this idea that, like, here's a problem people have, and so they're willingly giving over power to somebody else in order to solve that problem. And that for me is the really chilling thing about a dystopia and this type of genre, is that a lot of times it's not just that these people are living in a world where they are powerless, it's that either they have willingly given over that power because they thought that they were going to live in this utopia, or they thought that they were going to solve some problems, or somebody very close to them gave up that power for them. So it's kind of this idea. And again, this is, I don't know, this is like really dark and scary when I think about it, when I probe into this like part of humanity. But it's this idea that these types of, because honestly, when we're talking about dystopias, we're often talking about like a totalitarian structure of system, like whether that's government, religion, corporations, whatever it is in the story. It's some sort of overarching um entity. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these like totalitarian regimes. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for, because it can really be anything. But um you have this, and it's not that they came in and forcefully took it. In some stories they do. Um but in most of these stories, it's the sense that the people gave over their power to this totalitarian regime. um that they all kind of said, yeah, we will participate in this. I mean, certainly something like Hunger Games, even though that's YA, and we see over the course of that series the revolt against it, but people are willingly sending their children because they believe that this is, part of keeping a peaceful society. Same thing, Mel, you mentioned the lottery. It's very much the same thing of people willingly participating in murder because they think the ritual is going to benefit them as a whole. And so I think that, for me, if I'm drilling down really deep into what scares me about dystopian horror and what these authors and filmmakers, I think, are tapping into, it's that idea, not just of the totalitarian, like, grasp for control, but the fact that so many people are willing to give over power in order to do that.
Yeah, and just how easy it is to, I guess, I don't know, this may seem simplistic, but just how easy it is to slip from utopia or perceived utopia into dystopia. Like, if you've been manipulated into giving up power, or you gave it up because you thought it would protect you, like, not just realizing that you're implicated in what happened, but just how quickly everything can turn, everything can change.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you a question because I feel like that slipped into a very dark place, which we kind of knew it was going to. I mean, we're talking about dystopias here. Um, and we do, like I said, listeners, this is going to be a series. We've got at least 2 more episodes on this where we're going to, delve into some of the specific examples of this. We can't cover it all, obviously. I'm curious to know, Matt and Mel, from you. We've mentioned a few. There are a few we haven't mentioned, but what is your favorite? Like, if you were going to recommend to somebody, like, hey, you're embarking on a journey of dystopian horror, what is it? Now, Matt, I know you said Blade Runner, so I'm going to say you can't say that one now. Um, but what would you tell them to check out?
I'll jump in first. Can't say Blade Runner. So I mentioned Equilibrium before. So if that one is also off the table, fine. But I think Equilibrium is a very underrated movie, although it does have a lot of parallels with Brave New World. So people find it derivative of it. But I think Equilibrium is a great one. But if someone were just starting off, I would say probably Children of Men would be a fantastic starting point. And quite honestly, if they only watched this one and not the entire series, the first Matrix movie, I think is a very, very good example of dystopia. Honorable mention would be Gattaca, I think.
All right, let me see here. So, top dystopians I like. I don't know if I can pick like an all-time favorite, but I know I'm kind of violating your rule here, is that it's not my only pick. I just want to reiterate Octavia Butler's Parable duology. Because I just recommend Octavia Butler anytime I can. And I'm looking at the movies. We talked about a lot of them. I don't know. I think if you're going old school, Soylent Green is a good one. We talked about Soylent Green, I think, when at some point in one of our themes in the past, and I remember being struck by, I believe the year we talked about Soylent Green was approximately the around the year that it was in Soylent Green. I think like right now in 2025, we're like in the really, really bad part of it. So yeah, if you want to creep yourself out by watching something, with Charlton Heston from back in the day, that is basically talking about our time now, check that one out if you haven't already.
Yeah, I just had to look that up because it's been a while, honestly, since I've watched Soylent Green. But in 2022 is when the shortages started in Soylent Green. So yeah, I think you're right. I think we're well into the bad part of Soylent Green. I will also point out that I feel like more people need to watch this movie because I think the younger generations are not watching it, considering that we have now named an actual like meal replacement drink company Soylent. Um, that's disturbing.
I'm often horrified that people will be drinking, people will be using Soylent, and I'll say, "Oh, it's Soylent Green," and they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I think we need to bring it back.
I think I think we do. I mean, um, yeah, okay, so if I'm gonna give mine, I think y'all have given some really good examples, so I'm struggling a little bit. But I will say, Matt, I know you are a fan of the TV show Silo. Um, I think that's a pretty fun and interesting example of a dystopian community. Um, and I think it fits pretty much everything that we've talked about. And then Matt, I know on a previous episode you have mentioned the book series by Hugh Howey, and I actually went and bought them, and I have not finished them. But yeah, I really like this TV show. This idea of people living in this community, and especially, I mean, it's really good world building, but just also this idea of history actively being suppressed, where people are not allowed certain uh, certain bits of knowledge, and they're doing that under the guise of like protecting them. So I always find those kind of stories really compelling. So I think that would be a good one. I think, if you want to dip your toes into something that's like dark but not too dark, maybe look at some of the YA kind of like young adult middle school. Matt, you mentioned that like your daughter could probably name 20 more other ones besides like Hunger Games and Divergent and Maze Runner, because there's a lot of dystopia in that age range. A lot of it's very good. I remember reading a lot of it. Some of it does go surprisingly dark, even though it's made for children. And I don't know. I have my theories about why maybe this age group likes dystopian fiction so much. But also I think it's really interesting that it's being written for this age group too. Um, because I think I don't know. I've had some really interesting conversations with my 13-year-old about like the Hunger Games, for instance, and about like what it means when a small group of people hold the power, and why they might be targeting children for these kind of fight to the death games. And I don't know, it's been a really interesting way of talking about totalitarian governments, and when to be able to recognize that there's a power imbalance going on. And I don't know, it's really interesting, I think, to see how that age group has really locked on to that as a subgenre. So I don't know, maybe those would be worth giving a look. All right. Well, with that, I will say that I'm going to call an end to this first part of our look into dystopian horror. So this was a fun kind of discussion about what it is and why it scares us. We are going to continue this series for at least the next 2 episodes. Our next episode, we're going to talk about the Ursula K. Le Guin story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, from 1973. But then we're also going to talk about N.K. Jemison's response to that, which came out in 2020, which I think will be a really interesting conversation and kind of a look at those stories. And because I think the Le Guin for a long time has been kind of the short story that was held up as like the sci-fi dystopian story for a long time. And so I think it's really interesting to, I don't know, to see why that is, and maybe how it might need to be updated for today's world. But yeah, you'll just have to listen on to hear what we say about that. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. Or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. The music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.